there's an error on the rubric that was brought up about the length of the conversation. So again, as mentioned, it's 15 to 20 minutes, and then the total of this is 250. It was listed as 200 before. So just to clarify that. And then I have the example outline. So as mentioned, right, the outline is pretty similar, but rather than talking about the show or movie, it's explaining kind of the basics of the conversation. So you might use the first paragraph or two to say, I talked with this person on this date, the conversation was about this topic, but then things changed. And we started talking about, our favorite sports teams. So you might explain, how the conversation flowed, whatever context you need in order for readers to follow along. Rather than quoting dialogue from the show or movie, we quote dialogue or particular things that were said or maybe picked up on from the conversation, right? So that's there as kind of an additional resource. And then I have that example of transcribed dialogue too that you can use as you're working through. Again, model that I like to use is just kind of like a name or a letter, right, where it's a back and forth between two people. So there's a lot of flexibility about the transcription model that you do, but I just wanted to give you one example of how that could shake out. So I know we've gone over a lot related to that stuff, and again, it's those 4 pages, transcription and works cited. So again, to kind of look at a glance, we'll talk a little bit more about family communication and some of the challenges with effective family communication today. We'll look at work, and then next week we'll also look at some of the challenges of communication, such as aggression, bullying, and those types of things. And then remember, the essay itself is due on December 16th, and that the extra credit, where you're looking at an outside article related to interpersonal communication, is due by December 10th. So apart from attendance, which of course will be entered in for this week and next, all of your graded assignments are available on Canvas, so you should know your score going into the last essay. One way to kind of track your score is to figure out, like, if you have a total of 750 points, once we count attendance for next week, right? And then you take the score that you want, right? So 940 points would be 94% or an A. Take what you want, subtract the points that you have, and then the difference would be what you would need to get on the final essay in order to get the grade. So that might be helpful in deciding whether or not to do the extra credit. So you should see your grades and feedback up for the discussion leading, as well as that first essay, and all of those things, so you should know what to expect going in. So we talked a little bit more about family communication last class. I want to get into a couple more examples and ideas that help us to better understand some of these issues. And then I also want to talk a little bit about discussion leading. Again, depending on when you present it, you might have gotten the grades and feedback a long time ago, or you might have gotten it yesterday. So I want to talk about what I noticed in terms of what went well and some general suggestions since you are or likely will be doing similar types of assignments again in future classes. So as far as the discussion leading, I think I was really impressed overall with how folks did. I really appreciated the ways that you all worked together and shared some of the insights. So I really liked the overall, people had a really good knowledge of the topic. It was clear that everybody in the group had read through the chapter and had thought through some major ideas. So I really appreciated that folks came in with a good knowledge about these issues. I liked the way that folks used a lot of activities and examples. For instance, bringing in little video clips, posing questions with a group, things like that that broke up the discussion worked out really well. And then again, I think overall, people did a good job of kind of allocating speaking time and major concepts between group members. I know that group work is not our favorite, but it's definitely something that we can continue to do to help prepare us for all the times going forward in our lives where we'll need to do it. So I appreciate your work and coordination there. As far as things to continue to work on, kind of as across the board feedback, one thing that I noticed is that when you're ever in a class that involves a presentation and you can use something like an outline. I really recommend doing that. There were a lot of presentations that I felt like used the outline really well, but also some presentations where it felt like the outline was a little bit of an afterthought, like it was kind of very short, or missing some details or information. So one of the hopes here, right, was that the outline was designed to help you in following along and tracking material, especially as you do presentations, right? You can either have one of two problems, where either you have like a word-for-word notes, and when you do that, it kind of feels like you're reading, or you have nothing, in which case it can be a lot harder to remember the points and ideas you're covering. An outline format can be a really good way if you're doing a class of public speaking or any other formal presentation, because it's just enough information to jog your memory to be like, oh, hey, we're going to talk about this next, and to provide some important details to keep you on track, while preventing you from reading, right? It keeps things dynamic. It's one of the reasons why, like on slides, I won't include like a ton of content, but enough to kind of start the discussion and jog our memory endpoints. So I definitely recommend continuing to use outlines as kind of that middle space between totally extemporaneous delivery and totally reading. And of course, that'll change depending on the assignment. There were some good levels of focus from a lot of folks, but I definitely recommend whenever assignments like this give you the chance to focus on a specific area, that can work out really well. So, you know, in situations like this, you don't need to cover the entire chapter or be super exhaustive. You can always focus on like the part or the issue. One thing that is kind of what you don't expect, right, is that you think, well, if I only focus on part of the chapter, like I focus on this theory or these theories, then how am I going to fill in the time? But what ends up happening is when you dig in deep, there's a lot to explore within that idea. So don't be afraid to get focused in the future. Again, there were some good examples of focus, but it's something to continue to work on for these types of projects. And then I liked a lot of the activities, the examples, the questions posed to the group. And I just encourage you to keep utilizing those. Those can be great, especially early on as an attention getter. Like you're asking people to raise their hands to indicate like, how many of you have ever dealt with this? Things like that are a great way to engage with us, so continue to do that. So I want to transition a little bit and talk about the role of some challenges in family relationships, focusing specifically on siblings and marriage relationships. Before I do that, one other thing that I wanted to direct you to that I mentioned a little bit earlier is you should see, and you should have gotten an email about completing instructor evaluations on Canvas. So each quarter, right, you'll have those come up, and that's just a chance for you to enter in feedback about what went well in your classes, things that you'd like to see improved or changed. Please make sure to turn that in if you haven't done so already. Super helpful for me to know what went well for you and some things that I can do to keep working on and adjusting classes in the future. I take that feedback super seriously, and so that's just helpful for me to have a frame of reference going forward. So I want to transition and talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we face in family communication and our family relationships. Again, this is especially helpful if you're planning on having your conversation being with a family member, such as a sibling, romantic partner, and that type of thing. So one of the models that's given in the book, right, are different kind of stages of family relationships. If you think back to Wednesday, one of the major things that came up is the idea that not all families follow a particularly defined structure. So over time, what the definition of family means has changed a lot in the United States. We've moved away from kind of predominant cultural model of a nuclear family in the 1950s to a lot of other arrangements. But it's also important for us to remember that what family means has always meant very different things to very different people, depending on things like culture, nationality, and so on. For instance, right, the practice of arranged marriage has historically been a lot more common in India, but it's something that we see a lot less in the United States. So there's a lot of ways that sort of family has continued to play out differently. And so I kind of, in talking through some of these steps, want to challenge you to think about, you know, what's missing or what might not be included or thought about within this family structure. So there's one stage that looks at kind of younger single populations. So it could be the context of dating, cohabitation, people getting to know each other, right? If we think back to the 10 stages of relationship development, which by the way is a great example you could incorporate into your essay if you wanted to. Looking at some of the exploration stages in getting closer to something like a bonding stage are things that we see in that process. In this stage, with a lot of younger single folks, we see a lot of examples of people who are understanding each other's values and trying to find out who to connect with. Again, this ties back to the idea of chosen family. So a lot of TV shows like Friends will depict characters who are not necessarily romantically engaged, although that definitely happens over the course of the show, but are close to each other, consider themselves family, and so on. Young couples who don't necessarily have children. Young does not necessarily mean youth, age-wise. It also refers to the relationship being young, right? At that stage, there's a lot of kind of establishing fundamental resources, getting your roots down, creating closer connections to other people. Among families that might choose to have kids, whether they're adopted, biological, and so on, right? A kind of full nest is this idea that there are children who are very young, kind of preschool age. In that stage, research in family communication suggests there's a lot of stress, right? A lot of staying up late, a lot of challenges in navigating things like work and care. One of the issues that comes up is figuring out sort of the roles that parents or family members might occupy and dealing with tension that might emerge from the distribution of labor. As children kind of transition more into a school age, there's this idea that while there's still closeness, right, a lot of children are still kind of engaged, there are also a lot more opportunities for family members to work and to do other tasks. So we notice at this phase that a lot of times family members will have disagreement or discussion about returning to work if a primary parent or multiple parents are not working. And then the idea of an empty nest, right? First, the idea that a child has sort of grown up and is now living independently. I should mention as well that older children, there's the adolescent stage here, right, fit under this definition of still engaging with parents, still being actively involved, but creating their own identity. The idea of being launched is this kind of bird leaving the nest approach, where, you know, children are in a place where they're moving on and becoming their own adults. They're setting boundaries in relationships with their parents. So for many of us, right, including folks who might be younger, this is, for many of us, the first time living further away from family. And so this stage and sort of establishing somebody's own life can create some unique challenges in terms of the amount of contact and relationships that parents might have with children. So kind of in the later in life phase, where people, like parents, might be retired and no longer working, empty nest phase oftentimes involves a lot of new opportunities for social relationships. For instance, there are actually some studies that have found that among family members, sometimes grandparents have closer relationships with children than parents do. And that can be for a lot of different reasons, one of them being some of the ways that work can pose some unique challenges. And by being retired, sometimes grandparents have the ability to spend more time. And then a solitary survivor, right, is the idea that in the context of a marriage or family relationship, somebody has passed away, or maybe something like divorce has happened, and so there's kind of this shift away where somebody is trying to find ways to integrate and be involved in the family, given those kinds of changes. So there are some patterns in communication that have been found under this type of structure, and I guess what I'm curious to know is, given that, I guess, what's missing from this model? What are some things that we could add to or think about a little bit more here?
I mean, for couples that don't have kids, there's like 5 whole steps that don't describe them.
Yep. So there's a lot of steps, right, that families and relationships and so on can develop that don't necessarily involve kids, where there's emotional and social development among people, but for a lot of reasons, whether by choice, by other kind of structural or material factors, there's a decision not to have kids. Yeah. That's absolutely an example. What other situations come up? So one thing I would add, right, would be folks who, for either by choice or kind of by circumstance, don't necessarily pursue like a romantic or sexual relationship with folks. For instance, people on kind of asexual or aromantic spectrum, they have really good and meaningful relationships with other family or form kind of family of their own, but don't necessarily have that kind of model of relationships. Another thing to think about, right, is the role of extended family and kind of larger social connections. There's a trope that I've noticed that's really common in a lot of TV shows and movies where there's like an adoptive parent who has a much larger role and is seen as the true parent. And there's a biological parent who like comes in the middle of the movie and is like, I'm your real parent. And then the child in the show ends up saying, hey, maybe you're related by blood, but this person I feel like is my real parent. Right? There's so many examples to count of that one. One that immediately comes to mind is like the second Guardians of the Galaxy movie. Right? There's a lot of different ways that those relationships can be complicated by that. So I wanted to bring this up because while I think that the textbook, right, and any book in the class has some helpful ideas, no textbook in any of your courses or no readings in any of your courses are gospels, right? There's always opportunities to identify some of the things that are missing, that can be changed, that can add to the conversation, and those are a couple things that come to mind, right? This chapter also talks about toward the end how, there are a lot of things missing that continue to need to be talked about, but I just wanted to spotlight that, there's a lot more to this than this kind of model of family. So again, right, family and the way that it's modeled really tends to change and develop over time. And then another idea here, right, is the role of siblings and sibling relationships. So got another one of these 2x2 quadrants. I think the book really likes those. And these quadrants are related to sibling warmth and hostility. Ordinarily, you would think about these things as not being connected, right? But how many folks have siblings? Yeah, just about all of you. So you can probably say that, yes, both of these things can be true. You can both love and hate your sibling at the same time. And so, to me, that's part of what makes sibling relationships so interesting. That seemingly contradictory things are very true. So you can have uninvolved siblings where they have kind of low hostility, but also low warmth. These are siblings that you might rarely see or get in touch with. This is especially common in the context of folks who might be divorced, right, where there's half-siblings or siblings that are connected by blood that you don't see regularly. So that can definitely be one model. Or by virtue of living in different places, by being more estranged, and so on, the uninvolved model is one that we see a lot. The harmonious model, right, is something that we generally notice as siblings get a lot older, right? So later in life, we tend to move toward a more harmonious model where because a lot of the constraints and reasons why siblings don't get along are gone, you're no longer living under the same roof. A lot of siblings don't feel the same like competition for resources or love. There tends to be a lot more of those sources of hostility. A hostile relationship, right, is one where there isn't much warmth, but it's a very kind of negative or frustrating relationship. So if there's, for instance, physical violence or fighting all the time, that can be one way that that plays out. The TV show One Tree Hill, right, has these two characters who are siblings but really don't seem to get along for large portions of the show. There's a lot of different ways that hostile relationships play out. And then to me, the most interesting one, right, is an affect-intense relationship, where again, there's both strong love, but also strong hostility, that there are some really strong ups and downs. where siblings could be really angry and get into a huge fight, and then the next day make up. And one of the ideas here is that family kind of, a lot of times endures in the way that we communicate and engage in a way that we don't feel the same way about with friendships. That is, you can get into a huge fight and say, hey, I hate my sibling. But you come back later because either by circumstance or by choice, there was like a larger history or context that oftentimes will like make those relationships develop. Of course, right, there's also spaces where siblings, family members do not choose to maintain relationships with each other or choose to end relationships, right? It's not completely locked in. But a lot of times, there's a lot more room for ups and downs in sibling relationships. One example, I think of a very affective, intense relationship is, as I mentioned last class, one of my favorite TV shows, which is Schitt's Creek, right? The two characters of David and Alexis are siblings who really have some pretty strong ups and downs, right? They came in from a really rich family, they're trying to reconnect, and they have some moments where they're like heavily teasing each other, but also moments where they show like really strong and passionate care for each other too. So I just wanted to show kind of a short, funny clip from the show that gets into the idea of an affect-intense relationship. That these two characters feel a lot of intense connection and a lot of intense ups and downs with one another.
Just admit that you wanted the place.
I was just asking questions to help you make the right decision.
Well, you're a terrible liar, David.
It's a pretty good deal, though.
Seriously, why would you want to live in a house where someone killed themselves?
I can almost guarantee you that someone's killed themselves in this room.
Ew, David.
Okay, good night.
Good night.
You know, sometimes at night I see things.
God, David.
Yeah, like dark things. Like sometimes there's this old woman that paces back and forth by your bed, waving her hands over your face. I don't think her bony fingers ever touch your mouth, though.
Mom?
Do you ever wake up with chapped lips?
Dad!
Dad's dead.
Oh, you're such a dick, David. Stop!
Kind of funny, and an example of the ways that, right, a lot of siblings will bicker to make fun of each other and tease, but at the same time, like, are really close by proximity, having to be stuck in the same hotel room, or, you know, a lot of moments where they really care and look out for each other. So, we see a lot of those kinds of intense relationships shown through media. So, again, things like age, adoption status, household, number of siblings, are some of the many factors that can make our sibling relationships really difficult, right? And thinking about this quadrant, if you're engaged in a sibling relationship yourself, and you're talking with a brother or sister or whomever, that might be a model for you to think about. So, we might think about the idea of relational maintenance. Again, maintenance gets at the idea that there need to be, like with a car, repairs, changes, fixes, and so on over time. If we care about a relationship, even a little bit, we are generally using strategies over time to keep that relationship going, right? One of the major ways that we keep our relationship strong with our siblings is confirmation, acknowledging that we might love or care about the person, even if it's in a kind of silly or tongue-in-cheek way. One thing I find kind of interesting about that example video, right, is that, you know, David's giving Alexis a really hard time, making it hard for her to go to sleep, but sometimes, like, the use of levity, like practical jokes and humor, is a way that siblings will show some level of care in the relationship, where they use inside jokes in a way that, like, connects people that outsiders might not see. So social support, another key idea, gets at the idea that, you know, maybe you'll have a sibling who you can lean on for navigating some challenges. This is especially true if there's a fairly decent age difference in terms of growing up, dealing with certain pains or challenges in life, and so on. Family visits how often do you get in touch with somebody, especially if siblings are adults and they're off doing their own thing? Escape is another pretty big role, both escape from the relationship, so how do I get away from the sibling, but also escape within the relationship. How can I see this person as somebody I can vent and talk to? And then verbal aggression, of course, can be a major problem as well. But sometimes the use of verbal aggression and being open about the challenges that siblings experience can be a way that siblings feel closer to one another. So sibling relationships are really complicated for a lot of reasons. One of the biggest ones is this perception of scarcity and limited resources. So a lot of times, if in a household it feels like love is not equally distributed, that can be a big issue. So sometimes siblings feel a need to push and to define themselves as the favorite among their family members. And so the idea that there's only so much love to go around could be one challenge. But it can also be material too. The idea that there's only so much food, water, resources, or even arguing over who gets the better room or who gets which bed if siblings are to check into a hotel is something that can definitely come up too. So perceived differences, life experiences. In some studies, a lot of older siblings find that they have trouble because they feel like they were the test subject or the guinea pig, or sometimes feel resentment toward younger siblings because they say, hey, when I was growing up, I didn't get that kind of an allowance. And the younger siblings can say, hey, inflation. But another challenge, right, in life experiences could be younger siblings feeling like they're too often judged in comparison to an older sibling. So there's interesting work here about some of the challenges and also the establishment of identity, especially as a lot of siblings might be related to each other in teenage years and at slightly different stages of life. That can definitely come up as a different challenge. So another thing to think about here are some dimensions of marriage relationships, right? And these different dimensions include conventional versus non-conventional, ideology, interdependence, and autonomy, and then lastly, the role of conflict engagement versus avoidance. So what I want to do is have, we'll split into four. I know we're a pretty small set, so we'll have like 2 or 3 people for each group. So let's have 1, 2, and 3 focus on conventional versus non-conventional. We'll have 1 and 2 focus on ideology. We'll have 1, 2, and 3 on interdependence and autonomy, and then 1 and 2 on conflict engagement versus avoidance. I just want you to take a little bit of time to look at this relational dimension that should be talked about within your text. You can also look it up online to identify what that is and what an example of that might be. You don't need to write it down outside of any notes that you want to share to the group in just a couple minutes. What is, whoops, sorry, we jumped up a little bit. What is this relational dimension? What might be an example? So let's start versus, for conventional versus non-conventional.
Okay, so conventional marriage is basically like the traditional, 2 people fall in love, yada, yada, yada. Basically, the basic ass relationship. Okay, non-conventional is a marriage that deviates from the traditional patterns of marriage in a society. So basically they have open relationships, swingers, you know.
Sure. So,
well, basically, one's traditional and one's not.
Yeah,
open relationship versus not.
Yeah, I appreciated
An example.
the enthusiasm of that. That was great. So yeah, a conventional relationship we can get at. You can think again back to culture. You can think back to culture and some of the rules that members of culture might have. So for instance, somebody might be really interested in sort of following their own family and traditions. We see this a lot in terms of ceremonies, weddings, and so on. Conventional might also be, again, in a culture that has a lot of arranged marriages, the use of that. Non-conventional is oftentimes less based on some of the norms within a particular culture and more based on creating rules or agreement, right, among members. So, as folks brought up, for instance, like open or non-monogamous relationships, there's a lot of emphasis on members of that group creating an agreement about, how they'll manage that relationship. So you can probably imagine there's a lot of interesting and surprising work in interpersonal communication about poly and non-monogamous relationships, right? Where people are talking about how they form agreements, disclose, and share about some of their elements and so on. Talk about ideology.
So ideology is any like belief that you go into a relationship with about how the relationship is going to look.
Yeah.
Basically. So like in a marriage where they have kids, the two parents might have different ideas of what raising children looks like or how they're going to raise the children. I'm sure everybody has had that go talk to your mom moment or go talk to your dad because they have different ideas of how punishment or reward systems work with children.
Yeah. So you can think of that ideology as if you had to write the top 5 most important values to you, what are they? Ideology is kind of like the glasses or the lens that you're using to look at the world. If you're familiar with the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, he has this video where he's comparing and discussing ideology in the context of a film called They Live. And it's this film where it's like aliens have invaded the Earth, and if you put on a pair of glasses, you can see the real meaning behind messages. So there's like a billboard advertisement, and if you put on the glasses, it's like advertising like a marriage and wedding rings and stuff. The real meaning if you put on the glasses is marry and reproduce. So ideology gets at the meaning or the values behind what it is that people say. Interdependence on autonomy.
An interdependent relationship is when two people, both strong individuals, are involved in each other but without sacrificing themselves or compromising their values.
Mm-hmm.
These couples find a balance between time spent on individual pursuits and an example of. So an example would be like if one partner got a job and it was a good opportunity, but it involves like moving the partner away. And so like the other person might also move with them.
Yeah, that's a good point, Brenna, right? One of the challenges, you can think back to different dialectical tensions that were discussed in romantic relationships, friendships, and so on, is the idea that oftentimes a lot of family members feel challenges in staying interdependent, keeping close relationships, but also maintaining autonomy or the feeling that they can be their own people, having their own set of interests. One model, so there's like an entire spectrum of how close and how autonomous somebody might be in their family and marriage relationships. One way that can be talked about is how close a couple might be is the difference between this and this, right? The degree of connection is something that might be an area of disagreement, but also an area where people can work through together to establish how close somebody is. And then conflict engagement and avoidance.
So basically, these two types are just about how you handle arguments in certain situations. And people who avoid them usually try to, like, just avoid topics that make them uncomfortable. Like, for example, like, if you want to get divorced or something, like, you stay together for the kids. Like,
Right.
be an example of that.
Yeah, so that's a good example, Trey. So if we think back, right, to Wednesday, there was this quadrant of different relationships, and one thing is how open members of a family are in communicating about potential conflict that comes up. So, for instance, in a consensual relationship, there might be a lot more open dialogue, whereas in a protective relationship, maybe some of these topics and potential areas of conflict are just not talked about, right? So that can be an area of difference for sure. And then there's some different ways that we can think about marriage relationships that are talked about a little bit in your chapter. We did a good job of going over a lot of them through your comments already. The idea of traditional family categories and relationships is one area. An independent focus, right, is the idea that while there's some closeness, there's autonomy, people are off doing their own things. And the idea of separate, that could be a family that is divorced or separated or has a lot of physical distance, such as a long distance relationship. We lack the same level of contact, intimacy, and so on, right? So marriage is not necessarily the only way that close relationships are codified. We might think about how the role of civil unions over time have been used. And if you've ever seen movies like Four Weddings and a Funeral, you know that there are relationships where people will very specifically choose to be together while not choosing marriage. So there are some ways that that can be complicated too. So to wrap up for today, to get you out of here with an extra minute or so, family relationships have some of these unique tensions that we identified in terms of closeness with siblings and so on, and both hostility and work, and some of the ways that marriage and other close relationships deal with relational tensions like these. Again, these definitions and models are constantly changing, so there's a lot of ways that I think a lot of this terminology and way of thinking about these relationships can be even more inclusive going forward. So next week is our last Monday. So for this week, next week we'll look at interpersonal communication in the workplace. Have a good weekend. Please take some time to prepare for your essays and get all of that scheduled. Please also complete the evaluations if you haven't done so already. And pass forward or email your attendance for today. And I will see you soon.